I'm Simon DeDeo. I'm an assistant professor at Social and Decision Sciences here at Carnegie Mellon. And I'm going to talk about a short project we did on the marriage and divorce of capitalism and democracy. So this project began in part because I was asked to join in on a project. It's a new textbook that some of the economists are writing. It's actually one of these stone soup things. So there's about 300 of us involved in updating the core economics text that we hope undergraduates will use. One of the innovations of this book is that we go beyond a simple technical analysis, let's say a game theoretic analysis of how people engage with each other in the market, and try to understand capitalism in its historical context, in its cultural context, and in its political context. One of the basic ideas of core econ is that you can't understand how people buy and sell without understanding, for example, how people vote and how they see themselves in the context of a political system that gives them dignity, perhaps, that gives them a voice in their own lives. So today, when we talk about the relationship between these two core concepts, in some sense the concepts that define at least Western Europe, we often come with a perspective that is critical, that we think of democracy and capitalism as somehow in tension. So here's one of the political candidates in the 2018 and 2020 elections. This is Bernie Sanders. Sanders takes the position that Wall Street, it's a sort of metonym for capitalism, or at least the hypercapitalism we have today, that Wall Street is somehow destructive of or a threat to democracy. This is an idea that percolates through the academic world today, that percolates through the intellectual world. Here's a new book coming out by Matt Stoller that describes capitalism, and in particular the idea that capitalism naturally drives towards monopolies, as a battle between the political system that we have today. These voices, these ideas are not the only ones in play. So on the other side here, this is Deirdre McCloskey, one of the most interesting economists and probably one of the most wild writers. McCloskey has written a 3-volume series on the bourgeoisie, and it's in some sense a praise of the people that we love to hate, the people who gentrify, the people who buy and sell. So to oppose McCloskey to, let's say, Stoller and Sanders, here's some quotes, right? We can't advocate people, not profits, if you want the democratic advantage. Without buying and selling, we can't have a functional democracy. Here's another one. In fact, this is where she takes an even stronger position than saying that, in fact, the market may be a better form of popular representation than the voting booth itself. So these are ideas, these are battles we fight probably in our own minds just as much as we fight them in the ballot box. What we wanted to do in the core econ textbook was not settle this question, was not pick one side or the other, but instead to provide a little bit of a cultural history, because what matters is not just the underlying dynamics of political and economic freedom, but also the ways in which those participants see what's going on. And we're going to look at the relationships, we're going to look at the ideas in play when people talk about these two terms through the lenses of popular newspapers. So we took 3 newspapers, they're sort of the kind of lefty, middle-class bourgeoisie newspapers, The Guardian in the United Kingdom, The New York Times in the United States, and NRC Handelsblad, which comes out of the Netherlands, actually the merger of 2 newspapers. We picked the Dutch in part because our underlying account in core econ was that the origin of market capitalism happens in the 17th century, and it happens in part in England, but also in Amsterdam and the Netherlands. So really, really simple things that we begin with, right? Let's just count words, and in particular, let's, for example, take the New York Times, and we're just going to count the number of times that the word capitalism even appears, right? So to what extent are newspaper writers, are readers demanding that the newspaper even discuss the market economy? So this is really simple, right? You just open the text box here and you type in the word capitalism. If you look at those titles that comes up here, this is the New York Times search engine, some of them might look a little old school, and that's because I restricted the date range here to the year 1937. So when you run that through the New York Times search engine, you're going to get on the order of 304 newspaper articles that contain this particular word. If you want to do this in an automated form, you'll use something called an API. It's a bit beyond what we'll talk about today. You can do this by hand if you have the money to pay an undergraduate to just go and type in each year by year and write things down. Now, one of the issues that comes up is, okay, fine, right? There are 304 results for the word capitalism in the New York Times in 1937. But if we're interested in tracking the history of this word over time, the levels of usage of this word over time, we're going to want to normalize, meaning that if the newspaper gets bigger or smaller, the number of articles containing capitalism can get bigger or smaller. That doesn't necessarily represent an increase in coverage, just an increase in the ambition of the newspaper. So we want some kind of count of how many articles total there were in the New York Times in that year. So there's a really simple way to do this. It tends to work pretty well, which is just search for the word "the." Right? So some search engines will lock you out of doing this, but the New York Times doesn't. The Guardian doesn't. When we had to do this with NRC Handelsblad, we did a bit more hacking on the LexisNexis interface. We had to use something called Selenium. But here, actually, the Times is a pretty open system, at least for the older data before 1996. And so if you just say, like, how many articles contain the word "the," you get 163,000 or so. So you can compute the fraction of the articles that appear in the New York Times that contain the word capitalism in 1937. And it's about 0.1%, right? This is like advanced division, okay? Searching for the word "the," when we first sort of realized that there was such a simple way to do this, you can try a couple other words. "The" is the most common word in the English language, well, depending on your corpus. But you can also search for the word "and," right? And if you search for the word "and," you get a slightly smaller number of articles, 153,000, right? So it's a little weird to imagine an article without the word "and." Here's an example from 1937. It's an incredibly tedious list of Coast Guard orders. So these are people being transferred from one station to the other, being promoted, being moved from one position to the other along the coast. So maybe you don't want to count that. Maybe you think like articles that never have the conjunction "and" or never have the conjunction "but" or somehow sort of weird. They shouldn't really count as articles when we look at the intellectual representation or the public perceptions representation of things. So fine, just pick a different denominator. What you'll get is a slightly different answer. And the way we look at this is saying, look, is it 0.185%? Is it 0.198%? Differences of 10% here in the final value that we end up with. We probably shouldn't read too much into those, right? Small decisions about how to categorize the data change what we're going to do with it. All right, so we're able to compute the probability that an article talks about capitalism. That's just the number of articles that have it divided by the number of articles in the archive total. When we do this for the three newspapers, here's the Guardian, the Times, and NRC Handelsblad, we can just plot that as a function of time. The Guardian is the newspaper that goes furthest back. It goes, in fact, to the 18th century. And if you track this, okay, let's take a look at the really early period, so before 1850. Essentially, the only newspaper that's talking about capitalism at that point in time is the Guardian. If you actually dig into the archives itself, what you discover is that the Guardian at this point is actually founded in Manchester. It's founded by a liberal bourgeois mill owner, and it's discussing in part the ways in which workers can be compensated fairly without actually, let's say, blowing up the mills and taking them over. You can see some key spikes. I've marked them here. There's a period before 1900, the first large-scale strike in Belgium. But the first real peak, and you can spot it, is right here during the Russian Revolution. In fact, all three of the newspapers spike simultaneously when this happens over East. The next spike is the 1929 market crash. You can see here the New York Times responds much more seriously to the crash than the Guardian or Handelsblad, in part because the depression hits the United States much, much harder. And let's zoom ahead here into the fall of the Berlin Wall, a key moment in the battles between the alternative economic models, between the American capitalistic model and the Soviet model. At this point in time, you can see the Dutch basically lose interest, although everybody gets back in the game when things blow up in 2008. All right, so that's capitalism. We can run through. What we've done here is just tie together some of the newspaper stories with what's happening in the real world. We can go over now to the newspaper coverage of democracy. So now we're showing again, blue is the Times, red is the Guardian, yellow is NRC Handelsblad. And the first thing you can see is that the Americans are obsessed by democracy in a way that the Europeans are not. Here's a huge spike, the American Civil War. Here's another spike, World War I, another spike, World War II, yet another spike here at the invasion of Iraq, also at the fall of the Berlin Wall. You should be noticing a sort of pattern here, which is the Americans talk about democracy when they start wars and in part when they finish them. If you look at the data right now, coming up to the present day, we haven't seen democracy talk at this level since the beginning of World War II, so take that as you like. The final thing we're going to do is look at word co-occurrence. So what I've plotted here is the separate histories of capitalism and democracy in public perception. But what's really interesting is the ways in which people try and tie these things together. So here's an article from 1933, just about when the Depression really starts to hurt people in the United States. I've pulled out an article that has the word capitalism and the word democracy in simultaneously. So here's just an example. It's from a college professor who's worried about the ways in which the failure of capitalism might undermine democracy. The development of democracy in the United States as a reply of capitalism to the menace of communism was urged by the Reverend and President of Georgetown University. So what we want to do is now look at the ways in which democracy and capitalism are brought together by journalists, not just talked about independently. The two words could spike at the same time, but on different pages of the paper. What we're going to do is we're going to measure the joint probability. So you already know how to calculate the probability of capitalism in an article, the probability of democracy in an article. What we're going to do now is calculate the probability that the word capitalism and the word democracy appear together. This is how we write it, P capitalism, comma democracy. And you can just do the same thing with a search engine. So the New York Times, for example, will allow you to search for the word democracy and capitalism together. You measure the probability in the same way. You search for the and get the total number of articles. So you can measure the co-occurrence, the probability that they appear together, but you can also measure the independent co-occurrence. So let's say that these words are being used independently. Even if they are, there's still a probability that they'll show up together. You pull a bunch of words out of the basket. You might pull democracy with probability P democracy, and you'll pull the probability capitalism with probability P capitalism. The probability of them appearing together, if they're independent, is simply the product of the two. What we're going to do is take the ratio of these two objects. We call this R. It's the rate at which capitalism and democracy co-occur over and above what you would expect if they were co-occurring just by accident. So we'll plot that here. So this is the final graph of our little project. Yellow is NRC, red is The Guardian, blue is the New York Times. On the x-axis is, again, year. On the y-axis, in a logarithmic scale, actually, is the R fraction. So first thing you notice is the Dutch think that capitalism, or at least link capitalism, to the political concept of democracy at rates that are 10 or even 50 times higher than the Americans, who by and large consider them to be independent. The place that they spike at all, the place that they only barely begin to approach the Europeans, is somewhere around the Great Depression. Here's the line where capitalism and democracy are independent. The New York Times splits them early, gradually learns to link them. But the overall pattern you see is a delinkage, the divorce of these two words from each other. The Dutch, the British, and the Americans slowly disentangle them and come to talk about these words independently. All of these newspapers meet. They have a sort of global consensus on the extent to which capitalism and democracy are linked, somewhere around 1979, which for many historians might be the beginning of the Reagan era, the Thatcher era, and what we sometimes call neoliberalism. So we can track a cultural evolution, even in the sort of lefty middle-class newspapers, that tracks large-scale economic and political picture. So here's how the story goes, just to summarize. We begin, as we always begin in these kinds of projects, with a question. In this case, we know that there's an intellectual problem sitting here. What's the relationship between how we get our bread and how we get our presidents? We know that this is contested. We know that people have tried to put them together over time. And in fact, all three of these authors, Sanders, Stoller, and McCloskey, are talking about the ways in which we should think of them as brought back together. Then we build some data sets and we do some visualization. We do some very simple searching. We do some simple plots of their evolution over time. We make sure that things make sense, and we even get to tell some funny stories like the Americans talk about democracy when they send people to die. And then finally, we do some interpretation, and our little chunk of advanced mathematics here is this R coefficient, the ways in which these things are linked together. You can see the whole project as part of the core econ textbook. It's a free textbook, and if you dig in the 800 pages that sit in there, you should find this somewhere. Thanks very much.